and welcome to Rasa Chats, where we talk about conversational AI, NLP related stuff. And I am Rachael Chapman. I'm hosting you this time, and I am joined by a very special guest that I am so excited to talk to, Dr. Lin Blodgett, who, when I was working more actively, I was working on pretty much the same topic as I was. So, how dialectal differences, language differences are reflected in language use, and how NLP that. And she just finished her PhD at UMass Amherst, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remembered. And now you're at Microsoft Research. I'm trying to remember their acronym. You can tell me what group they're in, so I don't say it wrong.
It's handy. It's FATE, Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics, in Montreal. Well, in spirit, not in person. I'm still in Amherst, but I hear Montreal's very nice.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you would start by telling us a little bit of your research journey and why you got interested in topics in the first place, and some of your main findings. And if you can, maybe a little bit about what you're on now. Because I think particularly for context for our audience, the EU just shared their draft legislation around accountable AI systems. So I think this is something that is top of mind for many people, and it was a story.
Yeah, so that's a huge question. I could ramble for, if you ask me what I'm interested in, I could ramble for a long time. So I right now am kind of interested in a whole bunch of things that I guess I'd put under the umbrella of a very big umbrella of things like, things under, that I might call like the social implications of language technologies, which, as you can imagine, is like a whole lot of things. So for me, that includes like how like language technologies come to be, what are the ideas that like in ideologies about language speakers that govern their like development, organizational dynamics, and all these things. And then also kind of on the other side, right, like how do they come to impact people? How are people harmed? How are their benefits distributed? How do people come to encounter these things? Right, it's like a whole lot of things. And then, sort of, I guess, thinking like, constructively about how to develop more equitable language technologies, what those processes would look like, what alternative models of developing and deploying these things. So it's like a whole bunch of things you can imagine. There's like a bazillion things under this umbrella, and if I could clone myself, to do all these things, I would. But I actually, right, so as you said, my early work was on African American English or African American language. We worked with my advisor and Dr. Lisa Green, who is an AE expert at UMass Amherst in the linguistics department. And actually, this early work, I think, was actually not really focused on, it's a bit hazy kind of the origins now, but I'm not that old. I'm not even that old, but like sometimes like how these things get started is sort of fuzzy. But I was actually just always interested in language variation, just as language variation. So my mom is from Singapore. I spent like a good chunk of my childhood in Singapore. And where there exists like tons of really interesting language variation, and Singaporean English is one a really amazing variety of English. And so I think I was always interested in language variation. And in fact, I think early on we actually tried. I was really interested in Singlish on social media, and I think it happened that we couldn't get enough data. Right, it's like not a huge, not a really very big island, and there wasn't a lot of social media data. And we turned to language varieties that are more widely spoken, and also for which there was an expert, Dr. Green, at UMass. But what popped out of our findings, of that early work was that NLP tools. So at the time, we were looking at two kinds of NLP tools. One was language identification. So you take in text and you spit out what's the language it's in, the major world language, right, which itself is kind of contested, right? What counts as a major world language? And also dependency parsing tools, right? So tools to kind of output like structures of sentences. And we were looking at the performance of those on African American English, like text from social media. And you know, there's two like very obvious reasons. I think one is you want to know how these systems work because there might be kind of significant fairness or harm implications, right? The other, I think, is because my advisor, the lab in general, is very computational science oriented, and if you wanted to make use of this, use social media data, for example, for computational sociolinguistics, and you are using automated tools like part of speech tagger or a parser or a language ID system, right? Like you would want to make sure that that they were going to work well enough that you could, or evenly enough, right, that you could you could rely on like your results. So, and what came out was obviously, I think unsurprisingly, that these systems really exhibit significant performance disparities on different kinds of social media text. Yeah, and that sort of got me really interested in these questions of, how language technologies, work, how they ought to work. And at first, I think it was quite narrowly focused on questions of just, fairness, right? Like, in different language varieties, how might differences or different kinds of language features, right? There's people talk in all kinds of different ways. How might NLP systems, language technologies perform on them? But I think it really did just, when I also interned at Microsoft Research in New York a couple summers ago, and I think that turned into much broader questions about like how, as a field, as in NLP, right, are we conceptualizing bias? What's it mean when we say, things are biased? When we provide measurements of bias or harm, what are we doing, right? What kinds of claims are we making? What different kinds of harms might language technologies give rise to? What kinds of stakeholders are accounting for? These kinds are accounted for. These kinds of very, I don't know, sort of meta level questions about like what are we doing and when we're thinking about bias and harm in NLP. So this is still what I'm thinking about since I've come to MSR. So I'm postdocing now. So but since I've come to MSR, I've been increasingly interested in also questions around sort of like organizations, right? How, it is in practice, right? I mean, this, like the systems, the language technologies that end up, that people end up encountering or touching actually are produced in industrial settings. And so when we think about measuring social impacts, measuring harm, thinking about, to whom do the benefits of these things accrue, right? We want to know something about these systems, and that's pretty difficult to get us, to get a sense of, and the things I'm really interested in. So I guess I in my work, I guess I am indebted to tons and tons of different fields, right? So obviously NLP, but also tons of fields that have something to say about language, like sociolinguistics, right? Linguistic anthropology, applied linguistics, or fields that have something to say about how language works in society, how language constructs our social world, right? How people contest the world through language, right? But also fields like, fairness and justice and machine learning, right? Which really grew up sort of at the same time that I was in grad school and really helped shape my thinking a lot. Increasingly now, like HCI and other fields that have something to say about like how do we understand the impacts these systems have on people. And
being
human computer interaction. Yeah. And I'm not at all HCI trained, but in kind of hanging out with people who are, getting a sense of, okay, there are design methods, right? Or there are kind of approaches for thinking about how to include people in problem formulation, right? In different kind of stages of the design process, and also different kinds of methods for thinking about, what are the impacts on people, right? How people maybe beyond just kind of automated measurements, right? So right now I'm just trying to, I don't know, like not explode from trying to think about like all these directions and like all these people who I, really love to work with, and all these kinds of questions around like where are language technologies deployed? How do people encounter them? Like how might you how might you say no to them, right? If you don't want to, your data collected, if you don't want to participate in how do we know when they get it wrong, right? What kinds of things, like what kinds of ideas we have, like drive how they get deployed, and how do they reshape, our ideas about language, and I don't know, just a million things. Yeah.
It's a very rich question. Definitely feels certain to me, and I would imagine also to a lot of the sort of practitioners who are listening, that we are at a crossroads in what can do with language technology. And I mean, not just like from a technical standpoint, right? Like, I mean, obviously transformers have really changed what applications are feasible, but also from a frankly, legal standpoint, things are changing pretty quickly in terms of legislation. And also from a not only what will consumers accept standpoint, but also what do consumers want, right? How can we build systems that work well, that meet the needs of the company building them? Because I mean, there's no way to get around that, right? People aren't going to build something for no reason, but also are genuinely not just friendly, but useful and fair. And it's a
Yeah.
it's a rich area.
Yeah, there's no shortage of interesting questions. I think one thing that's really interesting about what you just said is thinking about the law, right? And what the law has to say about language technologies. I have been talking to some, of course, there's been a lot of conversations about this after the EU legislation, also like FTC, right?
Yes. Guidelines.
Guidelines, yeah. And so I'm not a legal expert at all, but I don't know. I don't really know anything about law, but I do find this question. I find this question really interesting, I think, because it's clear to me, and for this thinking, I'm definitely indebted to folks at MSR, including Solon Bogus, how a lot of the ways we know how to measure kind of like bias or fairness in language technologies and NLP is inherited from fairness in machine learning, whatever, which itself inherits from anti-discrimination law in the United States, right? Which is a very particular way of thinking about fairness or whatever. Is my system equally well? So often it's about how does my system allocate opportunity resource, right? Like the jobs or credit or whatever, and then more broadly, is it equally performant in some way, right, according to some measurement, like across different social groups or something. And so one interesting, really huge open question is like, does the law have anything to say about these other kinds of harms that language systems can give rise to? Right. For example, like, so it's kind of easy to imagine how you might bring the law to bear on questions, issues like, I don't know, like you voice recognition, you get into your car and like, it doesn't work for me, but it works, it works with somebody with like much lower pitched voice, right? Like a man, say.
Yes.
And like, I can't make the car do what I want to, but like somebody else can. It just clearly is a product that just like doesn't work for like large segments, like portion of the population. And I think I could see how the law might have something to say about that, right? But you could think about, language technologies, they reproduce particular stereotypes, right? Or they might be really demeaning or offensive, right, to people, or derogatory, or they produce like kind of like misinformation, or they radicalize people. People use these systems to radicalize people online, right? Or I mean, all these kinds of things where you're just like they just erase people, right? Or make it difficult for you to participate in public discourse, right? Because your posts get removed whenever they mention this topic, or because of your language features or whatever, right? Like, what does the law have to say about all of these things that could happen? Especially because these are sort of what we often think of as like representational harms, or harms that are about like how people are represented, and not so much about like I'm gatekeeping you, I'm deciding who gets like a resource or an opportunity. So. And I don't know. I don't know how we might think about that. So, yeah.
And as a little bit of an example that I think is very current is someone on Twitter today, being recorded on April 26th, was mentioning that TikTok had censored the phrase Asian women, but not Asian men or Black women. Like specifically the phrase Asian women.
Oh gosh, I so want to know why this happened. Like what blacklist or whatever were they using? Yeah.
Hard to say. Just like we can speculate. Perhaps it was some sort of dictionary based on terms found in a online pornography database or something like that. Hard to say, but this is something that like it's not stopping Asian women from getting a job. Right, but it may be preventing people from discussing aspects of their identity and finding solidarity versus in the public sphere. And I think it's clear that that's a harm. And conversely, I think that the people who made that change would say, well, no, we're preventing harm for these. And I don't think again, not a lawyer, talk to a lawyer. I don't think there's like a clear legal answer there, setting aside the like ethical and access issues.
No, I don't think there is either. And I think for me, there's a couple things that come to mind. Like one is like this very much brings to mind also recent research about like toxicity detection systems, right, which form like a core component of these kinds of things. They're often like, the automated part of like a content moderation system or whatever. I don't know if that's operating here, but they operate in a lot of places. And how they treat like mentions of disability, right? So like text that mentions disability, either like physical or so like I like sentences like I am deaf, right? Or like like mental disability, any of these kinds of things, they get disproportionately treated as very toxic. So a sentence like I am deaf is like gets a score of I don't know whatever really really high, is much more likely to be removed, right, or flagged as toxic or something. And you can imagine why this happens, right? It's because people actually do use like mentions of disability as like derogatory, right? And so like as insults, and so they often get labeled as toxic or whatever. But then then people who are just talking about like their lives or like engaging in like really valuable really valuable public discourse about like disability, right, like that, so this is like a really that to me is like huge, and we urgently need like a lot more research to figure out like why this is happening, where is this happening, and who's being impacted. The other is this question of like sort of like indirect stakeholders, right? And I think Emily Bender has brought this up in her some of her like presentations, kind of thinking about harms in NLP with respect to different kinds of stakeholders, and you can think of, right, like there's some systems where like you're like a really direct user, right? You go out and look for it, like you're like I want to go translate something, and then go to Google Translate, right? There's some things where you're a direct user maybe, but like you don't really have a choice, right? So I think Emily Bender's example is like a resume filter or something, right? And like you upload your resume, and like you don't really have a choice if this thing is operating, right? Like over your resume to see whether like you're qualified. But then like there's all these indirect users, like I didn't write a post on social media, but like I am on social media, and I like see like the accumulated out like effect of like decisions to remove posts or not, right? And we don't have any way of measuring something like, okay, like what is the accumulated like impact of removing, like if disability is treated as like super toxic and like it gets removed a lot of like very often, or what's the accumulated impact of this on public discourse, and how maybe are like people's like how is it impedes collectively, right, our ability to talk about things? How does it like how do we measure the impact on people's ideas about like certain topics or groups of people or certain kinds of language or whatever? And like all we know how to measure is maybe something like whose post got deleted, but not like what is the collective social impact of like these things, right? And I don't think we have any way of accounting for that.
Yeah, and I would say that's a big problem. A discussion that's again just been happening a lot recently mind is people who get death threats having their accounts deleted, and people who are making the death threats not having that happen. And in particular, it seems to happen more that people's accounts get deleted after they receive death threats if they are of a marginalized identity, although it could be that those are more likely to receive death threats. I mean, it's hard to say, and it's hard to get, especially like, let's say I don't run Twitter. I don't have access to the fire hose. It's hard to say, the degree to which is a problem, how often it's happening. It's happening often enough that users have noticed the problem, but are 4 high-profile accounts getting did going to shift a larger conversation, right, or even a certain social network?
Yeah,
to say, right? Hard to measure.
Yeah. Okay, so this, when you were saying that brought to my 3 things, but we'll see if I can keep them all in my head long enough to actually say what they are. So one of them is like this question of like community audits, right? Like how do people, so people often like, become aware of issues, often just through lived experience, right? And then, and so how, and sometimes people have actually sort of like by like, done these sort of community collective audits of like systems, right? So like, I think the one that we've all seen maybe on Twitter was like, like Twitter's cropping like algorithm, right? Like how does, and that was one where people collectively were like, okay, so I'm going to post a post and see what happens, right? And enough people do that, right? You get like something like an audit, right? That is, you don't have access to like this thing, but like you can access it, right? By having enough people collectively like test it and see what happens.
Background on this for folks who may be listening. What happened was if there was a picture with a white person's face and a black person's face, it would be cropped such that the white person's face was centered, and you'd have to click on the big image. And there were a lot of tests done on this to make
like no matter like people tested, what happens if I like change the ordering, right, change the position or whatever, right, have the white face on like in the upper left corner, like the white face in like the bottom right corner, like whatever, and like it just always seemed to have and I think it had impact. I think Twitter said like they were responsible, like thinking about like more responsible, I don't know what their effort is, but I think they said this is one thing they're going to look into, right? So collective. So it's like one question is like, how do you sort of enable collective audits, especially for systems where you don't have access to, or you may not really know anything about the algorithm, but maybe you do have access to some kind of outcome, right? And so you can test that. One other thing that also occurred to me is, just thinking about content moderation. I think it's like a really great example of these like sort of like larger like systems where the automated NLP part is just a part, right? And like your question of like how well your NLP system is doing is sort of like it's not very useful to ask how that part is doing outside of like the rest of the content moderation pipeline, right? Because like however your NLP, your toxicity system is doing, right? Like it makes a difference whether the rest of the pipeline is something like, oh, you just have a lot of freedom in reporting things, or they don't, or it's very easy to contest stuff, or it's not, or like it's very easy to block somebody who's harassing you, no questions asked, or it's very impossible. It's like all of those things are just as important as like whatever decision your NLP component is making, right? And like how that feeds into those. And I think the last thing, I think I did remember all of these things, is as they thinking, I think content moderation is so interesting because it brings up all of these issues, right? Is that that how people experience harassment in the world is like so different, right? Like according to kind of like different identities, different social groups, and this is one of those issues where it's so clear to me that like different errors are really like different in kind for different groups of people, right? And it's I think one thing that I'm thinking a lot about, right, is like what does it mean to enforce say equality of predictive performance, right? When like different errors for different people, different social groups might really mean different things. And if harassment is experienced in a much different way for some people, right? Like much more severely or something. Like, so what does it mean to say that like an error is the same for you as it is for like somebody else? And should we do that? And if we and what might we do that looks different perhaps than like equality of predictive performance? So I don't really know how to think about this yet, but it seems to me that like we should recognize this is a great phrase from someone, like the specificity of different groups experience in the world, right? And like that mean like recognizing that sometimes errors really are by our systems are experienced in different ways by different people. Then if so, what do you do, right? And how do you measure performance?
I think a good example of that might be something like there's been a lot of discussion recently of automated proctoring, and a lot of them are, I would say, extremely invasive.
Like is horrifying
required,
the
word? Like you're required to show your entire living space, like so that you can take the exam, so that you pass school, and you're not allowed to not go to school. So students don't have the option to opt out of this. And if you are in a living situation where it's fine for somebody to see everything, that's very different than if you're in a living situation. Let's say you're living in your car, or your family's living in your car, which is much more common, especially on the West Coast, that students have permanent housing. So what happens in that case, right? What happens when you have an unstable internet connection, and the internet connection cuts out, and that's going to happen more to poorer students probably, or students who have restricted data access for various reasons. And that error is going to affect some students more than others. And to be clear about my stance on automated proctoring systems, I think they are cool and completely unnecessary, and deeply privacy violating. And I don't think the benefit of ensuring that no student possibly could look at the textbook during the exam is worth that degree of privacy invasion.
Did you see the tweet? I saw some tweet where somebody was saying that their kid got Zoom detention, and I was like horrified. I was like, "What universe have we moved into where like like?" I think the worst thing was that I think this particular child like got Zoom detention because they had a hard time like focusing on Zoom in the earlier class, and I was like, "What productive purpose is sitting on Zoom?" More Zoom for detention supposed to serve anybody, right? Like it was just I don't know. It felt very dystopian to me, like how divorced you are. I mean, we were talking about Zoom detention, right? From like actually like thinking about positive outcomes for students.
But to conversation, maybe towards more solutions or suggestions for people who are working on conversational AI. I mean, I guess part of the good thing is usually the people I talk to are building systems that the output is not publicly available, right? So the content moderation is not quite as big of a part of the system. But there are definitely places where taking social considerations, that's probably a better way to say that, are important. And I mean, just right off the bat, language identification. So very common people to want to build assistance for multiple languages or multiple systems get sent to one or the other. Yeah, I don't know. What suggestion would you have for somebody in that situation? I think that's the end of my sentence there.
For language identification, like specifically, or just like conversational, like like AI, like more generally?
Either.
Oh man, okay, it's super broad. I mean, so I think there's a lot of things. I think for me, a big question, a big thing, is to inspect like the decisions that we make at every part of the pipeline like really carefully and to surface like any kind of like assumptions or meta beliefs that have been made, right, that we are carrying, right? So like if you're thinking about language identification, which I somehow thought that like that task had fallen by the wayside now that we just do everything end to end now or whatever. Like language identification, right, like it kind of actually embeds like a particular set of beliefs, right? Like one is that you can bound language varieties, which is actually very difficult. If you think about it, right, it's very difficult to do, right? Like what's within the boundaries of like what's considered standardized or standard English, right? What's considered African American English, right? Like what's the difference? Like how do you know when a tweet or is in one or the other, right? Is there a principled way to do that? I'd say no. And then the other is that okay, like the actual set of languages or whatever that you're considering. So, and this is just for language identification, but I think there's all of these things carry like we always carry like in problem as we do problem formulation, as we design evaluations, as we decide on annotation schemas and like who we want annotating and what speakers count and all these things. We're always thinking about like who counts, what language varieties count, what perspectives count. And there's a lot of little places where these things like where our decisions make a difference, right? So like if you get people to annotate stuff and then you take the majority vote, well congrats, like unless you've like sought out minority perspective, it is very possible like there's been some disagreement, right, that has been smoothed over. Just because language is subjective, it's contested, right? I mean, people who work in conversation know. I don't have to really tell you this. If you ask somebody, is this an empathetic response? You ask 10 people, like you're not going to get the same answer. So I think, and of course, it's really easy to get down the rabbit hole of like, okay, well, maybe there's no way to bound language variety or whatever, right? And this can seem so. I'm not saying like you cannot choose a way to do it, right? Or take this problem, recognize it's impossible to do perfectly, but you're gonna try, right? But I still think I think it is really helpful to like try to deliberately surface as many of these like little like sort of decisions that have been made implicitly. And to think about what gives rise to them, right? And of course I always think that I mean, I guess this goes without saying, right? But I'm going to say it anyway. It is involving different speakers, different people.
Absolutely.
One, just because there's really no way of like your outsider best guess of language use is like not going to be it's like not what you want. Another is and of course I say this not because like it's like these where you don't bring in like different people in order to like offload the responsibility of like doing like fairness or bias or like harms work on those people, right? But we do it because people deserve a say in like how the technologies are built. Sometimes the answer is, well, I mean, this is not a good solution probably for practitioners. Sometimes the solution is genuinely not to build at all because people don't want it.
I mean, in the chatbot
Yeah.
space, that is, does it need to be a chatbot? Is question number one, and the answer
Yeah.
is only sometimes.
Yeah, and so I don't know. I think most of these things are right. So it's just like recognizing that there is no, I don't see, right, like ever like an end point for this kind of like, I don't know, the like the fairness or bias or harms work or whatever that I think about, right? Like if we're thinking about like, you know, how do we distribute the benefits of technology in like a fair way? How do we make sure people aren't harmed, right? How do we don't reproduce harmful ideas, right? I think of these as like, okay, then our processes have to be iterative and like continuous. And you just have to, you know, and just like always interrogate your decisions and just, you know, accept that like, and also accept, I think like dissensus is a thing, right? And just, you know, one thing we maybe don't know how to do in NLP is to figure out like what happens when people disagree on if this is a good output. This is a good output, right? This is something my talk about to say. People will disagree. And this is just like a fact of like, you know, social life. A fact, it's like a, you know, a fact that when things are deployed, some people will think it's great and some people will say, I hate it. And so to think like, you know, okay, like given that these things are deployed in these social, you know, in our social world, like how do we think about this dissensus? I don't have an answer for that, but I think, but I think, I guess that maybe one last thing I'll say is that I recognize that like it's super hard to do this kind of like fairness or bias or whatever work. It's just really hard because especially because language is so hard. Language is complicated, it's messy, it's subjective, right? It's very contextual. Language is entangled with identity in so many ways, right? And language shapes our like collective understanding of like our shared reality, right? How we understand the world. And like even something as straightforward as like make sure this system uh you know exhibits equal predictive performance across social groups like gets so hard like immediately, right? Because you're like, oh, do I mean language produced by different groups of people, or do I mean language about different groups of people? Am I worrying about things that are like by proxy associated with groups like names or pronouns? Am I like worried about like linguistic features, like features of A, E, or L, where like I don't know if this was produced by a speaker, but like this seems like a feature, you know, like do I attach this feature to like a social group or not, right? Like it's so hard. And so a question that seems really easy is actually not. So I'm super sympathetic to this. Like I don't imagine that it's easy. And I think just like, you know, the like transparency and like, you know, like transparency in terms of like, okay, like, you know, I don't know how to account for everything. I can't account for anything, but like, here are the things I thought about very explicitly and like why I thought about them, right? Is a way we like collectively make progress.
Yeah, something I like to is that in technology, nothing is inevitable, right? Like
Yeah.
any decision made in a product is a decision, even if you're like just like I'm going to use the thing everybody else uses, and like I consider this to be neutral. I mean, you're still choosing to amplify the systems that are already in use, and that may or may not be a good choice for the population, or may not be good choice for like a specific individual in your population. It's hard. And I think for thinking about, you know, that sort of variation and how people react to a system, one thing is definitely giving people, specifically for conversational AI and chatbots, a way not to interact with the assistant. Like for some people, it's great, it's what they like, but usually it is augmenting some sort of human conversational structure where people are talking, giving people the option to talk to humans, or to do things another way, right? Rather than the conversational interface, I think can go a long way towards helping those people for who a conversational system is not the best way to get done what they need to get done, which is going to be some people. Yeah. And then I had a note that I wrote down, and wow, can I not read that? It looks like indirect lasers, but I don't think that's what I wrote down.
Man, if I knew how to talk about indirect lasers, I don't indirect stakeholders maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
The stakeholder seems like a longer word than lasers. I don't know.
Who knows? Clearly, it wasn't that important if I didn't
Yeah.
remember it.
But I mean, I love this point, right, that you made about like the non-inevitability of technology, right? Like what we build, I mean, like the things, systems that exist that people encounter are just the accumulation of like a bunch of everyday decisions. And the more we can like, surface those decisions and make ourselves accountable for those decisions, like, I think the better we'll be, because you don't know what you don't know, but like as long as you don't know why things have emerged the way they are, you can't really, change them, right, or test whatever.
And I think it's particularly for people in the NLP space, I think it's really important, even for practitioners, know the history of the field. I know this is such like an academically trained thing to say, but I think that something that I run into a lot that's pretty common is people who have like never built or think they haven't interacted with a rule-based system, and sometimes like they work great. Sometimes rules are what you need, and not having sort of the historical understanding of the development of NLP and sort of the steps that we took through to get where we are now and how that affects like A, the questions, the tasks that we work on, B, the approaches that we use, and C, sort of formalizations and abstractions and operationalizations of
I can never say that word.
quote unquote unstructured text or speech or whatever, and turning it into numbers. I think it really helps to highlight these were choices. These were all choices made by like specific people in like, I don't know, Bell Labs or wherever.
And like specifically also, like I think, one thing that come into contact with other people thinking about other people who are not computer scientists who come into this fairness and machine learning space, right? Is thinking a lot about like, so when you talk to people from other disciplines, right, it really forces you to reckon with like the boundaries of like your own, like, I mean, both the things that but also just like how you think about the world, right, your epistemology, like how, like what do you think constitutes knowledge or progress or whatever, like what is a good solution, all this kind of, and we're in CS, I mean, like we're trained in a particular way, right, we're trained in like, okay, like, you want to abstract away everything that is that is not, that you cannot write down in code, right? Like if it's can't write it down, it's too messy, right? And your, efficiency is good, and portability is good, and like you want a system that is like, you can like move from one context to another, right? And that's good, that's progress. And it's like these are not like universally terrible things, but also sometimes they just like are deeply at odds with like how language works in the world, right? How the world works, how people talk to each other, communicate with each other. And I think it's like, it's really like, you think about it, it's a little absurd to imagine that like one, NLP solution, you should, for this context, for this group of people, for this like, like goal, you should just be able to pick it up and, move it over here and it should work just as well, right? Whatever. So like, I think a lot, more recently about how, like where, I don't know, my training is actually like useful, and where it kind of is actually like, actually it's not that useful because it's making me like adopt this assumption of what that actually is, at odds with like what would really be useful or helpful. And there's people who've, of course, like academics who've written about this. But yeah, it's something I kind of I'm trying to like figure out like, okay, what why do I think this is a good idea, right, or whatever, or why do I think this is the way I have to evaluate this, or the solution has to be like this.
And I think a good sort of more concrete example that I run into a lot is, we all know machine learning is great, right? More machine learning, more data, more, neurons, you get better results, right? And that's particularly conversational AI, particularly for languages without a lot of training data, just straight up not the case. It's not necessarily going to help your system to use the pre-trained model that requires 10,000 examples to fine-tune. For example, if you have 400 and that's what you have, in that case, stepping back and being like, okay, so this is the I had, this is what everyone says, but it's not helpful for me in this situation, and it's not going to help my eventual what can I change? What can I do different?
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, and I guess for researchers, right, a hard part of this is sometimes like, if I do the thing that I think actually works well for this use case, can I publish it? And sometimes the answer to that is no. But that's maybe a problem with research incentives and not, and yeah, so.
Yes. So we have just a couple minutes. I know you've got a lot going on this week. Long. But is there anything that you would like to say to the community, or anything you have to pitch, or anything to look out for? I will actually pitch for you. Your presentation just came out, and I would highly recommend at least like skimming it and picking out a couple chapters if you are thinking about things like systems existing in a social setting, which they do. They all do if you're working on conversational AI. So it's very, very, I think, helpful to have understanding and some citations, getting to understand what the effects of that are and how to think about that.
Well, thank you. I should say it's a little bit scary to think about people reading it. Like, you think about the dissertation as like the version maybe nobody's supposed to read, but yeah, there are like I did try to like bring together like a lot of citations from like all these other fields. And I guess maybe one thing I'll pitch, I don't know, it's not the right word, but one thing I'll say is really that very little of what we do in NLP is like really new, right? Like, and in some ways, right? Okay, maybe like the technology is new, but the things we have to say about language are really not new, and like the social relations that these systems are growing out of are also not new, right? And there's like so much to be learned if we're thinking about building better conversational AI, or safer systems, or systems that don't reproduce harmful ideas or whatever. There's like so much from other fields where people have thought about like language and society and people and how these things are related, right? And I'll say not just like linguistics, so although I do love sociolinguistics, but feels like education. Like where almost nowhere else, right, is like language like contested and recontested like all the time, right? People are grappling over language, and ideas about language are inculcated, and all these kinds of things, and a lot of what you might think of as resistance to like harmful ideas about language, right, happens, for example, in education. So there's like, if we want to think about like building better systems, more equitable systems, it really makes sense to think about what these other folks have to say, right? Not reinvent the wheel. And just also like honor all the work that they've done, right? Like people who have done the thinking about like language, and like how language serves or contests oppressive systems, whatever, right? Like have done this often through lived experience, so like often at a great cost, right? Like it's something we really want to. It's thinking that we really should bring aboard and really value. And yeah, I mean, other than that, man, I don't know, so many things. Yeah, I think I'll stop. I'll maybe stop there. I mean, I could sort of put on an Emily Bender hat a little bit and say maybe like slow science, right, or slow NLP, right, and really thinking deeply about like who our systems are for, what we're building for, whether things need to be built at all, who is who is involved in the process, right, and all these kinds of questions. But there's a lot of things to think about in that space. So I'll just kind of, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And a wonderful conversation, and it's great to actually like talk with voices.
It's so good to finally meet you. It really, like, I feel like I've been like giving like lots of presentations this day, like Chapman 2017, great paper. So it's like nice to finally get to talk about stuff.
Really, yeah, and I think there was a lot of food for thought here for the conversational AI community and practitioners, and lots of stuff to carry around and unpack. And
I mean, I certainly haven't thought through it all. So if anybody wants to talk to me about it, please do.
And you are on Twitter?
Yes, yes, and also a very, very sporadically updated website, and yeah, and an email address too.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much for joining me today, Lynn. Thank you for joining the community. And stay tuned. We we'll shout out our new contributors. Thank you for listening. Thanks for joining for the Rasa Chats podcast today. As always, I want to take a moment to shout out all of our new contributors to Rasa Open Source. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Rasa contributor community. We are delighted to have you. And if I mispronounce your name, please get in contact with me and I will correct it in the next time I do the podcast. So without further ado, let's thank our contributors. Maximilian Bischoff, Nth Attempt, Talus0248, Soma Nagay, Steve Lamb, Rafael Todosio, Kaio Giorizato Uch, Louis Owen, Ayuri Severo, Armin Jindal, Ayush Anand, Bas Berg, and Satyajit Patanayak. Thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions. We're delighted to have you. Welcome to the contributor community. And we look forward to seeing what you do in the future. Everyone else, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this was helpful and informative and fun. And we will see you next time in Rasa Chats. Talk to you then.